For those who don't know me, I'm Milagros Peña, also known as Millie, the Dean of the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences. It's incredible having all of you come to this day-long event, to have this wonderful opportunity to hear colleagues engage us, I think, in a very, very important conversation. But first I want to take a chance to thank a few people. One of the people I'd like to thank is Anil Dillard, who's the Dean of the School of Public Policy. I think he stepped out for a minute. Is Anil out there? Okay. But anyway, I'd like to thank Anil and the School of Public Policy for joining the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences in collaborating on this event. And also, I want to thank the Center for Ideas in Society, in particular, Georgia, who's the director, for her support. And more importantly, for Anil, I just thanked you in the School of Public Policy. And also, Catherine Henshaw and Mark Manalang. Is he here? He's also in the School of Public Policy, but between the two of them, they really carried the day. So I really want to take an opportunity to give both of them a round of applause. And I also want to thank the organizing committee who helped us identify the colleagues who are going to be speaking with us this morning. David Brady, Bruce Link, Ron Loveridge, Juliet McMullen, and Tony Lawrence. Thank you so much for allowing us to have such a wonderful panel. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all for coming and joining us today for as much as you can, and the wonderful conversation that's going to ensue between what I would call academic types, but also the folks in the community, the responders, and those of us who are also academics, but are deeply engaged in the community in having a serious conversation about how we can support each other in the work that we do. In the meantime, I would like to invite my colleague Anil, who's also going to say a few words and introduce the keynote speaker.
Thank you, Millie, and welcome to all of you, especially folks who came all the way from around the country, New York, Arizona, where else do we have people from? Washington, D.C., and even some of you came from San Bernardino. That's often sometimes the most difficult commute. It's easy to get here from Washington, D.C. and New York. I hope you are all comfortable in the Mission Inn, and we are very much looking forward to a day of discussions and also informal conversations with each of you. I missed the first minute of Millie's introduction, so she may have said things that I am probably going to repeat again. But we think this is a very important topic. Disasters, natural disasters, man-made disasters, are going to be a more frequent occurrence in the coming decades because of things that are happening around the world. Climate change is going to ensure that we are going to have natural disasters with much greater frequency. All the sort of interstate, inter-ethnic, inter-religious conflicts that are taking place around the world will probably result in more sort of disasters of the type that we have seen in the last few years in the United States. Terrorism-related disasters, shooting disasters, and what have you. So I think social scientists as a community have not really sort of yet fully addressed this issue of how do you prepare for these disasters and how do you sort of ensure that the community and the nation and individuals recover quickly from these disasters and become more resilient. And I think resilience is something that is sort of a very important topic these days. I understand that the NSF is pouring lots of money into resiliency research, whether it's resilience not just of communities, but also resilience of the the power grid in the country. What happens in the case of a power grid going down? How can you quickly recover from such a traumatic event? So I think we hope that today's discussion sort of gives us just a few pointers in what kinds of research are helpful, what kinds of research that we do in the universities might actually make the job of first responders, community organizations, a little bit easier in dealing with disasters and in making communities more resilient to such disasters. So that's sort of our goal in having today's workshop, the beginning of a conversation. And we hope this will lead to more work in this area at UC Riverside, both in the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences and the School of Public Policy. With that, I would like to move on to introducing our keynote speaker, whom we are very happy to have here today. Maria Dillard is a research social scientist for the National Institute of Standards and Technology in Washington, D.C., NIST. And my first response when I saw her institutional affiliation was, what does NIST have to do with disasters and recovery? And I think she will probably, I hope she will address this issue in her talk. It turns out it has a lot to do with this topic. And in fact, they have a whole group at the NIST on community resilience. And Maria is the research social scientist for that group. Previously, she was a social scientist for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's National Centers for Coastal and Ocean Science. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of Pittsburgh with a focus on the measurement of socio-ecological resilience for coastal and island communities. Maria is also an adjunct faculty at the College of Charleston. She has more than 10 years of experience in social science research within academic and applied settings. This includes interdisciplinary research for several federal agencies, such as the NIST, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the Veterans Health Administration. Additionally, Maria has professional experience in community engagement through positions focused on communications, public education, and community outreach for environmental, healthcare, and social issues. I could go on, but I think I will probably stop there and let Maria sort of speak. And in terms of logistics, I'm assuming that Maria's keynote we have the next 45 minutes, but if you decide you want to sort of go to the Q&A a little bit earlier than that, that's fine, but we are basically not breaking until 11:30, which gives us a good hour and 20 minutes for Maria's presentation, followed by a Q&A. So, Maria.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate. Can you all hear me okay? I don't know, do I need to, let me turn this around. Okay. It's interesting, the timing of this, this presentation. You're getting a bit of a 2-for-1 on the federal perspective, because I am only about 6 weeks into my work with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and come from many years of being in a very different perspective within NOAA, where I was looking at the natural environment and human communities and how those two connected. And now I've shifted over to looking very much at how communities and the built environment are interacting. So you'll hear a little bit of both within this talk. So I'm going to start with an introduction of myself, but more importantly of the agency that I'm within, because there are many people who've never heard of this agency. It's a small in terms of budget in relation to the other federal agencies, but it has a really fascinating mission. I will then move on to some background on the concept of resilience, how it's risen, what some of the current efforts look like within this area, and then move into talking about the research and activities at NIST focused on resilience and disasters. And then finally, I want to come back to this idea of opportunities to support resilience, to support work on disasters. And I'm going to address this from a couple of perspectives, but really lead us into the discussion there. And I have a couple of slides I stuck in at the end that have ideas for research. So these might be some things that students who are within a social science discipline might look at and think about in terms of how they could connect to this topic. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is within the Department of Commerce, and it is really focused on measurement science. So measurement science is designed to help inform standards, but most of the standards that we're informing are actually set by private and other private sectors within the US. So NIST is providing the science that helps set these and then kind of making recommendations or driving some of how these things get set. So this can be everything from, as I say here, from nanoscale devices, really, really tiny microscopic things, to how we design earthquake resilient skyscrapers. And all of that falls within this very diverse agency. The question then is, this sounds like a lot of physical science, maybe some very highly technical skills. Where does social science fit in within this agency, and kind of how does that look within NIST? I think the easiest place to start with this is the part of social science that's had a home within NIST for quite some time, their Applied Economics Office. So that office is looking at a variety of ways of providing research and technical assistance that can be kind of handed to decision makers to help them with setting these standards. So one of the items that they're working on presently that's a great crossover to my program is the quantification of co-benefits. So what are the benefits of planning for resilience that happen before a disaster strikes? How is this a beneficial thing for communities to do when they're talking about retrofitting existing infrastructure and changing building codes? The other thing that they are working on is predictive modeling related to wildland-urban interface fire prevention. They've done work looking at the cost of sustainable building throughout the life cycle of the building. And then in addition, within NIST, there's been a shift to doing more multidisciplinary work related to disaster and failure studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that area of research, but two places where this started, social science kind of started to sneak in, were in Joplin, Missouri, following the deadly tornado in 2011, and then also with the World Trade Center collapse. Some questions that they were looking at on the engineering side started to be inherently social questions, and they realized the importance of a kind of broader toolkit of methods. And then finally, the newest area of work is the work on community resilience. And this is going to approach resilience from a systems perspective, including the social system as part of measurement and modeling of the built environment, and how we look at a community in relation to both its physical needs, but also the social needs that are being supplemented by that. And in this work, it's really going to examine these linkages and think about how they interface. So this brings me to the concept of resilience. And I think it's important to acknowledge this is certainly a buzzword. This concept has gotten great interest and acclaim. It's sort of blown up in terms of who's doing it and how many articles you see related to the concept. But I think it's actually inherently a really useful concept. And part of the reason that I think this is true is that it's drawing together and creating space for lots of different types of people and perspectives to come together to address some of the complex problems that have arisen. And I think that we don't always need new words and new language to do this for us, but sometimes it helps a lot to have this kind of new space created within our academic worlds, within our applied research worlds, and within kind of application, within management and policy making, where we start to see that there's reason for multiple disciplines, multiple types of individuals to be coming together to work on problems. And I think that really is something that we get out of this concept of resilience. And I think part of it is this recognition that multi and interdisciplinary work, it's necessary at the moment. We're facing complex challenges that can't be solved by one discipline or another, and we really have to move into a new way of thinking about these problems. So I'm going to define resilience here in terms of how NIST is thinking about it and how certain aspects of the federal government have approached the concept. But what I want to acknowledge is there are many definitions. It has a long history. This concept started in ecology, in engineering. It took hold in psychology. It's been in sociology. There are lots of roots and historical origins of this that have looked at it in slightly different ways. But these are kind of current definitions, and you'll notice these are both presidential policy directives. So for the federal agencies, these are definitions that we're kind of operating under and having to take into account. But the part that I've highlighted in green is really how NIST is defining resilience. So this piece of it is the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover rapidly from disruptions. The remainder of this comes from a directive that was really aimed at the Department of Homeland Security and the work that they're doing related to resilience. So you see where we diverge slightly is focusing on just this much broader suite of hazards. It's not that we're not taking into account some of the terrorist threats that may also pose hazards, but we're looking at both natural and technological. And then in the final bullet, for us, with community resilience, the emphasis is not solely on mitigating risk. So it's not at the front end of a disaster only. It's also in the recovery of function. So the recovery at the end of a disaster, and that time frame may be quite long. So we're really looking at a process in part as kind of giving us a sense of how the resilience plays out for a community. So why has this concept become so big and so popular? What are some of the reasons? And these are just a few of the ones that I think have an impact on why it's taken hold. One is that there's been an amazing increase in presidential disaster declarations and the costs associated with these. So this figure shows a 10-year period and the concentration of disaster declarations by county. And of course, these declarations over time have had an increase in the amount of cost associated with them. So if you look at the trend lines over time, it's a substantial increase. So we're seeing a need for communities to go outside of their own resources because the disaster reaches a point where they aren't able to cope with it on their own. We also have new challenges associated with things like climate change. This is a broad-based challenge in that it has lots and lots of impacts, differential impacts based on where you are within the country and within the world. And it's something that it has slow changes over time, so it creates some chronic stressors, but it also has immediate impacts that are being felt now. Many of the communities that I've been working with in the last 5 or 6 years have already been experiencing some of the impacts. I don't think this is something that we can say is way down the road anymore. It actually has real present effects. We also have growing populations in vulnerable areas. So if we think about areas of high risk, the population moving to the coasts has increased dramatically. The trends show a great concentration in populations moving to coastal areas. And then we also have trends towards urbanization, so people being clustered in spaces in much more concentrated, dense ways than we've had in the past. These things all create challenges for how we address disasters. And finally, I would say there's a recognition that previous approaches need some revision. We've been trying to address these problems, but we haven't solved them, and we see the problems getting bigger, and we realize that maybe what we've been doing hasn't fully satisfied the level of the problems and the scale at which they're now reaching. So this is a small sampling of the wide range of resilience activities that are taking place. So I've provided, a select example for several of the federal agencies that are engaged. And again, this is a small list. There are multiple activities under each of these agencies that fit within this broader realm of resilience, especially disaster-related resilience. And then in nonprofit organizations, again, this is a select group of some of the players that are investing really large-scale dollars across the country, but there are many more. There are groups like Rockefeller Foundation that have created the Resilient Cities Initiative and are creating the space for resilience officers within various cities. And those sorts of organizations are really creating this additional drive to community resilience planning and other efforts. Resilience planning is something that NIST has gotten into, and part of why comes from this perspective of we were focused on buildings, on infrastructure, and looking at how those things were impacted by disasters. And there was a realization that you could propose new building codes and new ways of addressing those different aspects of a community, but that is sort of missing a piece of what's necessary to actually change policy, of what's necessary to create that incentive for a community to move forward in addressing some of these risks that may exist. So the idea broadly of resilience planning is that you would enable communities to recover and rebuild in a more thoughtful way if they faced a disaster, and perhaps allow them to improve their existing state even if they don't face a disaster. It would build upon existing plans. So this is important, that we wouldn't be suggesting communities need to add another activity to their long list of planning initiatives that already are required, because that would be overwhelming, and most communities would probably have very little interest in doing that. But this can be either built into existing plans or can draw together different components of things like comprehensive plans and hazard mitigation plans. Importantly, it would encourage coordination with nearby communities, various partners at the regional, state, and federal agencies, thinking about the boundaries of a disaster being different from the boundaries of a community or a governing body for that community. And importantly, it would address all of the activities that go through recovery. So it might start at the beginning thinking about how you might prevent some of the harm of a disaster, but it would actually carry through and think about all of the ways in which you would address the disaster throughout the whole cycle, through recovery. This type of planning is important and maybe, increasingly necessary because of the types of disruption communities face. We know what the impacts look like when disasters hit. You're going to hear about many of those later today from the other panelists. But these impacts, some of them, not all, but some of them can be reduced by managing the risks better, especially for some of the disasters that we know are coming our way or that we know our communities face a great risk of experiencing. And by planning and implementing prioritized actions or measures, if we have ways of making decisions about how to invest our resources, we can improve the ability of a community to come back better and be able to recover following these kinds of events. So this brings me to the activities and research that are happening within NIST, and these are activities that really focus on resilience and disasters, and it'll give you an idea of how we're approaching it and also some of the ways that I think other research is really necessary to feed into this thinking. NIST research in the areas of disaster and community resilience really spans a lot of different areas. We have a group working on community resilience assessment tools and metrics, so that's what I'm part of. We have a team that works on wind issues and the impacts of tornadoes, and they're working to create the first tornado hazard maps for the US. We have a group that does earthquake engineering, so they're looking at how to strengthen buildings in order to have them, and infrastructure lifelines, to have them last through earthquakes in new and improved ways. There are engineers that are working on multi-hazards, so they're thinking about structural performance of buildings with respect to a number of hazards, including human or technological types of disasters. And this includes fire and a variety of other types of impacts. And finally, we have a group that's working on fire, and they're really looking at structural risks from fire. So all of these things, with the exception of the top item, are very strongly tied to built environment. And you'll see how the top line of this starts to get us a little bit broader in our thinking. We have a disasters and failure studies program within NIST, and this group is charged with determining when the agency can learn something from a disaster or a failure, structural failure of some sort, that can help improve future codes, future standards, design standards for buildings and infrastructure. And this is a list of the various disaster events that have been studied. And I'll say that this group is increasingly going to include social components of its study as it moves forward. So while it's in the past been very much focused on just the engineering, there is a recognition and a desire to broaden that and think about more of the social components of why these disasters had the type of impact they did. Because I think they've realized that the building didn't collapsed and that was bad, but it was bad because of what it meant for the community, because whatever function that building was serving is no longer being served by the building if something happens to it. And those functions, depending on what they are, become really important. Within the resilience program, there are a variety of activities that are being invested in. And one of these is the Community Resilience Panel, which is a forum that's creating a space for stakeholders to collaborate and achieve consensus around some of the gaps and barriers to achieving community resilience. This panel is open to membership of anyone. They have meetings in person, but also virtually, And it's really creating a space around a variety of different systems, built environment and social and economic systems, to think about what needs to be done as we move forward for resilience planning. We have a large investment in a community center of excellence, community resilience center of excellence that's led by Colorado State University. And they are working to create models and ways of determining disaster impacts, but in a really holistic approach. So they're attempting to really do broad systems level models that look at the range of impacts to things like population dislocation, how you may have business level impacts, so economic, and how those kind of trail through a community, and then also the physical and infrastructure impacts that then create things like a lack of water being accessible to particular parts of a community, transportation networks diminished. So they're working first to model these impacts and then the recovery of the community following an event, so that they can create tools for communities to use in determining what impact it would have if they were able to do certain types of actions, put certain things in place to mitigate these impacts. This is a long-term effort, but I can say we just came away from a semi-annual meeting where we started to see some of the research that's coming out of the different groups. And it's amazing amounts of thinking from a lot of different perspectives coming together in really exciting ways, where I think we'll in the future see some really profound impacts from this. One of the big efforts that the Community Resilience Group has invested in and has been carrying forth is this Community Resilience Planning Guide. And this has 2 volumes. One takes you through the 6-step process, and this is really something to kind of pass to communities that are interested in how to engage in resilience planning. And then the second volume is a reference volume that kind of helps explain some of these different system components that are examined. The planning guide is designed to be very practical, very flexible, so to create a methodology that allows a community to work through setting priorities, allocating their resources, and managing their risks. And it is focused on the built and the built environment, but it's got space and it stays silent on certain aspects in order to allow for it to be used in a broader range of ways. So my first look at it was, well, where is the natural environment in this guide, because of my perspective and where I was coming from. And I can say, fortunately, that it's flexible enough and allows for that. Many communities are including that as part of what they are assessing and how they're approaching resilience. And the reason that NIST is focusing on the aspects of built environment have very much to do with where our kind of federal responsibilities and mandates lie, but it isn't to kind of suggest that resilience has these boundaries. I think we're very much in recognition of the fact that it needs to be this holistic effort. So the guide was developed with a great deal of private and public sector input and also a lot of stakeholder input. It was kind of presented and refined through a series of workshops that involved stakeholders in order to get it to a point where people felt it was a usable document, a usable guide for how they could approach this effort. And it really does identify great spaces for collaboration. The 6 steps start here on the left side and then kind of follow through the diagram. And it goes from everything, from starting with the development of a collaborative team all the way through plan implementation and maintenance. And it looks very, I think it looks simple, and it looks like these are things that we would expect of a planning process. But what happens in this process and what makes it different is really in the step 1 phase, where we're drawing together people within a community, different decision makers and entities that don't always talk to one another. So our emergency managers, alongside those who are within the utilities, the private sector running the telecommunications network. So these individuals come together in order to inform this process, and they actually develop a plan that they all can agree on and inform. A couple of key concepts out of this work. One is the idea of functional requirements. So infrastructure and buildings play a role in supporting society. But what we think of is, we think of those things somewhat independent of our social system. And this document is really trying to kind of make the connection between, on the left side of this diagram, the functional requirements of the social institutions. So all of our social institutions have requirements of the built environment. And if we're going to address the resilience, we really have to think about these things collectively and understand how we are assessing those needs and building for those needs. Another important concept is the recovery of function. So this is something as a non-engineer that I didn't appreciate, that after a disaster, one of the things that engineers are thinking about and the way that they would assess when a building is okay, again, is whether it could obtain a certificate of occupancy. So once it was safe enough for people to be in that building again, it was kind of checked off the list and it was recovered. But that didn't have anything to do with whether the function that the building previously served was regained. So if a hospital was able to have people within it, but there were no staff anymore, and the electricity was still off, and you couldn't get people to and from the hospital, it hadn't it didn't recover its function yet. So this is one of the ways in which we really want to evaluate whether the system has reached this point. Another critical aspect of resilience planning is going to relate to creating the economic drivers to make decisions that will allow for improved resilience. So we've also created an economic decision guide that supports the methodology, the 6-step planning process, by allowing for economic decisions to figure in benefits and costs of competing alternatives, of not doing anything, and these can be looked at alongside the different implementation suggestions that the plan might put forward. And it helps to prioritize those activities. This shows the 7 steps of the economic decision guide in relation to the 6 steps of the plan, so you can think about where the economics really become important. It's very much in that plan development phase when the community has some ideas about where they want to go forward, and they're trying to decide between which things they're going to make active right away or not. We've developed guide briefs, which are shorter documents that supplement the planning guide, in part because there was a need for additional resources on some of the specific steps. So a few of the guide briefs that have been published so far, you see here, characterizing the population. For social scientists, we would say this is a really huge, massive step. It was distilled down into a pretty short little, concise step within the guide, but for a community to do this and actually really have information that can be of benefit and use in planning for resilience, it's a much more involved thing. And these are some of the spaces that I really think research could help facilitate what communities are trying to do on their own in terms of planning and response to disasters. So I want to go into the planning guide a little bit in detail to show some of the connection points that I think research has for the guide. I think these are spaces where communities, whether they're using this guide or they're actually engaged in other planning steps, may really benefit from the infusion of support from those within the academic sphere or other applied research centers, because they often don't have this capacity internally to do some of the work and are really in need of information and data to help drive the decisions in a better way. So I think as a sociologist, I'm often obsessed with community. What is community? How do we define it? And it's important to understand in this case, the way we're thinking about it is both a geographic distinction, but also a political distinction. So we're talking about communities in relation to having a governing body of some sort. And that's important because the planning guide and these sorts of efforts are going to make policy recommendations, and those can be implemented within a governance structure. That said, we know that some systems are going to go beyond the boundaries of that community, of its physical boundaries, beyond its political boundaries. So a lot of partnership and acknowledgement of that is needed in the process of planning for resilience. Because if you're really resilient as a community, but your neighbor isn't, when the disaster hits, and if it hits you both, there is going to be an impact that doesn't allow either community to do as well as it could if they aren't working together. So I think that's an important component. So the guide begins with this step one, where the community develops a planning team in order to engage in the guide. And I say this is a space where it's a bit different from other efforts. Instead of looking within one part of the government, it really seeks to draw in representatives from multiple parts of the government, but also from the private sector. So it's thinking about which businesses are responsible for healthcare. Many places have healthcare institutions owned privately. You have things like utilities and telecommunications owned privately. So if those individuals are kind of working independent of the government in response to a disaster, it's going to be problematic if you haven't spoken before and don't have relationships in place. There are organizations like those responsible for relief, voluntary organizations that work in disaster settings, education organizations, health, faith-based, and many others that also have a role in this work. And as somebody who's worked in communities and has experienced the side of trying to engage and go through a planning process, what I would say is really key is, let's see if this works, this one component here of the representation of all interests. That doesn't mean physically represented in the room, so you're not going to get every community member and every stakeholder in that space, and actually that's not going to be effective for driving the process forward. You need individuals that are well selected to represent and give voice to all of these interests that exist within a community, and that will really carry this forward. It can be a time-demanding process, and so you really want people who have the ability and the capacity to engage throughout the process. The next step, once you have the team in place, is to understand the situation, or really the context. So this is where I see a lot of infusion of research to be very beneficial. The community needs to characterize its social dimensions, so it needs to understand things like its demographic and economic conditions, its future needs. It needs to understand what are the functions of its existing institutions, where do they have gaps, where are they dependent on other organizations, and then kind of changes in the community over time. A couple of critical concepts for this is that the community needs to be able to understand the social vulnerability. So there are existing vulnerabilities in place that are differentially distributed across its boundary. It needs to understand where those pockets of great vulnerability lie in order to start to understand how it's going to address that difference, that inequality that exists following the disaster, but also perhaps before as well. These are things that we often see a disaster really make worse, not make better. And if we've got these characteristics in place in advance of a hazard, it doesn't take as great of a stressor or a suite of stressors to push some of these groups over the edge in terms of being at a place where they can cope versus not being able to cope at all. On the opposite side, we have concepts like social capital, which really help us to think about the ways in which communities have some strength inherent already through networks, shared norms and values, and things that allow for cooperation and kind of support inherent among groups. So this kind of capacity is really important because it can facilitate information sharing and allow for services to be provided across space in response to a disaster. But I would also say it's likely that social capital doesn't exist in an even way across the whole community, that it may exist within pockets or among particular groups. And it's important to kind of have a sense of that going in and be able to understand what role that might play in recovering from a disaster. If we take kind of a big step back and think about society having needs, so people have needs that are kind of inherent to their survival and their existence. This figure is adapted from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and it starts at the base of the pyramid with the most kind of foundational, essential, and it moves up. So as these needs at the bottom are met, you can get to meeting the needs of these higher order concepts. And we kind of like to think that a resilient community would be able to meet all of these needs through their social institutions. But the way that happens and the extent to which that happens, I think, is going to vary tremendously from one community to another. And then even in thinking about how a community recovers, thinking through these stages and how these need to be kind of recovered one at a time in order to get a community back to their full state of function. And they may never have been at the top level before. So it's also important to think, what can we do to be pushing up towards those higher order needs? So these needs from the previous diagram, like the bottom two, survival and safety and security, are going to be met through social institutions in part. So things like healthcare are providing health services, providing for public health, they're providing equitable access, we hope, to medicinal products, vaccines, technologies, they're providing health services to communities, to individuals, and they're trying to meet those needs from the previous diagram. Those institutions in society rely on a variety of things, but one of those is the built environment, which includes buildings and infrastructure. So those things are feeding into our ability to function these social institutions. Again, for healthcare, it would be hospitals, clinics, pharmacies, those types of built environment things, and perhaps the transportation network. If we think about how services are delivered, those are necessary for those functions to be met. So it's important to understand both the social context and then the built environment and how it has dependencies, how it's laid out across the community, what are the types of systems and buildings in place. And following that, we want this team of people to really start to link the social functions and built environment. So the team that's planning needs to understand how some social functions are very much dependent on the built environment. Some functions are going to change when a disaster happens. So the built environment, if it's a school, it might become a shelter. And they need to understand how that interplay is going to happen, how they're going to get back to restoring the ability of the school to provide educational services if they are using it as a shelter. So seeing and understanding these dependencies and the impact of these dependencies is really important. So this slide sort of pulls us back to the high level just to think through how these things connect and to think through what we're asking a planning team to do and thinking about planning for resilience. It's not an easy task. So we're thinking that there's damage caused by a hazard and that damage is going to be experienced in this built environment. The built environment damage is going to have a consequence on the ability of those social institutions to meet the needs that are on the right-hand side of the diagram, which then we kind of have these impacts that result. So where we were meeting the needs of employment and income, we now have a loss of employment and income. We might have a loss of business revenue because we no longer have businesses that are able to function and operate because we're not able to meet the needs that those businesses had in order to stay open. So those things really, there is an important connection. It's important to be thinking through those connections and how we really want to design and improve communities in order to avoid some of the negative consequences that a disaster might have. The last step that I'll talk about, because this is the step that leads just in before the plan development, is determining the goals and objectives. And in this step, the community is going to set some long-term goals that are going to help guide what they envision for themselves. And these are some of the possible goals. And they may not be related to the built environment. They may have goals that are much broader, much bigger, and then they're getting expressed in relation to their environment. And then the community will develop measures that are going to help them track the progress. So these can be qualitative or quantitative, but they need to kind of be able to assess how they're reaching these goals as they move forward. One of the key pieces of the goal setting is to establish desired performance goals and assess the anticipated performance of the built environment. And if I am talking to some engineers in here, forgive me, I'm going to go over this pretty quickly, but there are a variety of ways that the desired performance goals are set. And those don't have to be in relation to the hazard event. So those are, where do we want to be? And then the anticipated performance is really depending on, based on what we've experienced before or some anticipated level of damage, where do we think we can be realistically? And this gets summarized and kind of addressed in a matrix like this, where here I'm calling out the critical facility wastewater, and you see that the goal is to have 90% of the wastewater treatment recovered within 1 to 4 weeks. The much more likely outcome, the anticipated performance, is that you would reach that in 4 to 24 weeks. So there's a gap identified, and then some measures can be taken to try to align the desired performance with the anticipated performance. And that's one small example from a much larger process. So I want to bring this to a close by talking about a few examples of the guide in use to give you a sense of how this is being applied, how some of this thinking and this approach is being applied, and what are some of the partnerships that are developing in order to do this. So it's being used for a general resilience assessment for the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. The Department of Homeland Security has a regional resilience assessment program, and they help fund and support resilience assessments and other resilience activities. And in Colorado, they are utilizing that program to help guide them through this. But it's also, that program is serving kind of a supporting role, but not a leading role. And the community is in the third step right now, where they're trying to set those long-term goals. In Boulder County, Colorado, they are using the guide in an innovative way along with their state resilience plan to try to evaluate projects that have been put forward following their big flood that they had. I believe it was last year. The flood recovery money has kind of come in, and they wanted to evaluate projects using some standard. So they've decided to utilize some of the goals that they've developed in the resilience planning guide in order to do that. And they're involving city and county governments kind of collectively in this effort. In Delaware, the Department of Transportation is using it to assess 2 highway corridors. These are two coastal or river-connected highways that are subject to flooding. They know there will be increased risk with climate change, and they really want to determine how they can improve the function of these highways. Now, interestingly, here they're not looking at built environment solutions. They're looking at natural green infrastructure solutions for both of these highways. So again, that shows some flexibility in how the guide is being used. And also, because the highways run naturally along many communities, the Department of Transportation is trying to bring together multiple communities to actually engage in the process and be part of that collaborative planning team. And finally, I have an example from California where in San Diego, they're using this as one reference in the development of a scenario exercise. So they want to plan for a 6.9 magnitude earthquake on the Rose Canyon Fault, and they're doing this exercise in collaboration with Tijuana, Mexico, so they can start to look at how a disaster on the border would impact both communities and how they might respond collectively. So moving forward, what are some of the opportunities that we have to support resilience, to support disaster-related efforts that would get our communities to a better state? One of the things that I wanted to share was a quote from the mayor of Fort Collins, Colorado, who is talking about the long-term horizon with planning for resilience. So resilience isn't something that we think is going to happen immediately. It's not an objective that communities feel they will achieve right away, but they also are looking at it as an investment, a long-term investment in improving their ability to recover following disasters. And thinking about this idea again of actions to improve resilience can offer immediate dividends beyond resiliency. So what are the ways in which actions that are taken today can have kind of an immediate effect even if the disaster doesn't hit is really an important question to try to answer with research as we move forward. And I think there are ways in which that is not just an economic question, it's a social question as well. So where we are presently, there's an increasing number of communities doing resilience planning, but it's still rare. It's not one of the many plans that communities have on the list of regular plans that they put in place. So that, I think, is part of our present condition. There's still a reliance, I would say maybe an increasing reliance upon federal disaster funding for recovery. So there aren't other mechanisms in place to help communities recover when disasters strike. There's not a lot of systems thinking. So thinking about how social and the built and the natural environment, all these things interact together, what are the components of that? And as a result, I would say we have fairly siloed attempts at problem solving. This is true in our research and is becoming less the case. I think it's also true in application that we have things working in isolation. Like the engineers previously at NIST were working on the structural failures, but not thinking about what consequence that had for the society. And ultimately, I think also we've kind of gotten to a place where there's a disconnect between our solutions and place, so some context of place, that I think has led to a lot of great potential solutions, but they don't feel like they would work in particular communities. And so moving forward, ideally, we would see this more proactive plan development where communities were looking at disasters and preparing for them way in advance. We would see reduced costs of response and recovery as a result. This is a hopeful thing, I think. We would see these last three things, systems thinking, interdisciplinary teams, and solutions rooted in the context of place, is becoming very commonplace. And I noticed that these three components here are some of the things put forward by the School of Policy at UC Riverside as some of the ways in which it sought to be distinct. And I think these are characteristics that we can really generate and develop and help perpetuate as we go forward in developing resilience. I think these are concepts that are becoming increasingly important. They're things that we can be working on, developing capacity in, and can really help us move forward as we conduct research and as we try to apply that research to communities that are facing a range of risks, both long-term and much more short-term, kind of chronic stressors. So with that, I am going to pause here, ask you to please visit our website for some of the materials that we have available, and feel free to contact me for any more information. Thank you.
Actually, why don't we, thank you first of all, Maria, for a fascinating presentation. I think I increased my knowledge of resilience by a factor of 100, if not more. You addressed so many issues that I had incomplete information about or ignorance about. Let's open it up for a discussion, any questions, and in fact, I don't really need to moderate anything because you can probably just address the questions that the audience has directly. When you ask a question, please give us your name and your institutional affiliation, if you would, please, so everybody knows who you are and what point of view or what organization you are representing.
All right.
Hi, David Abramson from NYU College of Global Public Health. That was a great presentation. Really, as Neil said, covered a tremendous amount of territory. And I had a question about how you could mobilize and initiate these resilience planning efforts, given that they're not mandated. They're not part of some regulatory framework. They're not part of hazard mitigation planning. They're not part of comprehensive zoning and planning. They're not part of floodplain management. They're not part of any of that.
Right.
So the question would be, is it your thought that it should either go to become a mandated activity, and if not, how would you engage communities, and what kind of civic engagement process could you imagine, aside from the rarefied few that are doing it now, that would be truly equitable and have a responsible planning effort rather than just reinforcing existing power structures?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and in part, it's one of the difficulties of putting forth something that's yet another non-funded. So there's no funding from the federal government in my program to support these communities, and that's the ones that voluntarily want to engage. So I actually do believe that the ideal would be that we sort of move to a place where this type of planning is somehow mandated as part of the overall planning efforts, and how that plays out without increasing burden tremendously. I think that's an area that needs to be explored. I know, from work that I've done in the state of Maryland, the state is actually moving towards requiring counties to include resilience within their hazard mitigation plans. How they include it and in what ways that takes hold is varied. And so it may not be as broad sweeping as what we've put forward. I do think that there is a really important role for those working in communities or working with communities to have, in terms of infusing some of the types of ideas into the planning process. And the communities that have experienced disaster and know the difficulties of working across all those different partners and players when a disaster happens may be more receptive than those who haven't experienced that to starting to engage and think about how it might play in. But I also think being very open to encouraging it in pieces or in phases where it makes sense is probably the best at the moment. So if there is a very particular set of funds coming in and it could be used to help identify how those funds are utilized, that may be a space for the process to gain some traction. I do think that collaborative planning team development piece is a tricky one. I think that it's always hard to figure out how to get the right people selected, not to just perpetuate the same voices being part of the process, and also to move that forward. So, I mean, my kind of personal desire for that would be that we would really seek to look more broadly. It's not a guarantee that you're going to get people to be able to maintain participation at all levels of this process either. And so maybe thinking about at which pieces of the process you need to really reach out more heavily to particular groups or representatives. And I think, you know, some mix of people who are on the ground working in a community with the people working in government is really important to kind of mix and cross some of those boundaries. But I think it's a role that some of the extension kind of agents in both cooperative extension or in Sea Grant and groups like that kind of work at the interface of the community and the academic institutions could play a role. And certainly, you know, organizations, nonprofit organizations that are working to try to kind of facilitate some of those connections. But I don't have an easy answer for it either.
I have a question related to that. It's a follow-up question. What about if you can't mandate it at least, are there ways in which the federal government or even state governments can incentivize such behavior? I am not completely sure about it, but I heard someone tell me that in Japan, especially in the aftermath of the earthquake they had in 1995 and then the Senkai sort of tsunami they had 6 years ago, that there's a pot of money at the federal level that is given on a matching basis to communities and cities and counties that sort of do their resiliency planning. And so the government, the national government sort of matches it, not 1 for 1, but maybe 1 for 3 or something like that. And at least there is some incentive funds which help communities sort of take responsibility for drawing up these kind of resiliency plans. Is something like that around in the U.S., anywhere in the U.S., either at the federal level or at the state level?
I think at the state level, and much of it is supported by federal funds, there are some programs that really do allow for communities to get investment for the process or for taking particular resilience actions. Another avenue for some of this that we're hoping from the federal level to be able to suggest and explore, and I think this is being explored elsewhere too, is the idea of insurance being a way of kind of helping to make that incentive a reality. So if we can identify ways in which, you know, insurance premiums could be brought down for things like flood insurance or wind and hail insurance, that you might really kind of find, and I would say the FEMA's community rating system is a mechanism so communities get points for engaging in particular proactive planning efforts. And the insurance premiums for the whole community will go down as a result. And so there are some things like that that are in place that I think have a tremendous impact. And if we could just broaden their usage and application, it would really make a difference.
Jim Elliott, Sociology Department at Rice University. While we wait for the mandates and the incentives, which I hope are forthcoming, I'm not from Riverside, but let's say I move here and I want to get involved in this planning. I know it's unfair because you just sort of entered into your role, but you mentioned something at the beginning about trying to develop these community resilience assessment tools and developing the methods and metrics. So if we wanted to go out from here and over the next month to 12 months plan to do this, Do you have any suggestions on how we would go about implementing these methods or metrics?
So that is one of the kind of amazing pieces of the role that I've come into, is this idea of developing some of the methodological kind of tools for assessing the present state of resilience, and then over time kind of how that changes. And you know, there's this interesting balance, and I've heard this throughout my career in developing measurement of different things. Some of you know that I worked in developing community well-being measurement, and there's a hesitation to put measurement on something like resilience because it might mean something different for each community. It may have some kind of context-specific factors that we want to take into account. But I think on the flip side of that, there's a danger in not providing any guidance about how to measure it. So what I'm really hoping is to provide some set of metrics that communities could use to do some assessment, and then, you know, providing for that ability to kind of see where you are now. And then I think that opens this discussion of where do you then want to be? What are some of the actions you might want to take from here? And I think then, you know, a community would be positioned to pick up the tools, the guide, the supporting materials that exist, and start working through them. We are hoping to, so the economic decision guide has a tool in progress so that you wouldn't have to have your own economist to be able to run some of the analyses that are necessary for that cost-benefit analysis. The resilience planning guide doesn't yet have a tool associated with it, and we are talking about that. We're talking about what that should look like, what would it need to be, what would be helpful. So that's really an area of ongoing discussion and kind of infusion of what are the things that people hear from communities that would be useful, because I feel there are lots of tools and lots of assessment protocols out there, especially on the topic of resilience or disaster preparedness. I do not want us to develop another, you know, thing that sits among all of these other amazing tools that have been developed. I would like to see something that, you know, that really does respond to some of the specific questions that are out there that can't be answered by existing tools. But I also think, you know, there's a lot of this that requires people to kind of take the documents and the guidance that's been set forth, and some of the, they work through a few examples. So like with an example community, they work through some of the steps, and then take those and kind of carry them forward in, you know, through the community's own lens. So it would kind of require some adapting of the existing materials.
Your name and affiliation?
Oh, sure. My name is Faith Kearns from the University of California and the Water Institute at Oxford. And I'm wondering about the concept of social vulnerability. So I'm a natural scientist, and I feel like the concept of social capital is slowly like leaking into the natural sciences, but the vulnerability piece is not something that I hear often unless I go into a more sort of social science space. And I was talking to a student a couple weeks ago about like a vulnerability index. And I guess I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how people look at vulnerability and sort of quantitative measures and more qualitative.
Well, the great thing is I've got a panelist who I know is going to speak about this further. I find that very interesting because coming from the environmental science space for a good while, social vulnerability is much more common and talked about there, especially with respect to climate and natural hazards. So we're thinking about it a lot in that area. There are several ways of kind of known and proposed ways of quantitatively measuring social vulnerability, and I would suggest also qualitative ways of assessing it as well. And I think there are lots of approaches to that quantitative measurement that are going to vary with respect to what types of characteristics become part of it. And some of those may be very specific to a particular type of disaster. So sometimes people are thinking of it only with respect to how an individual or a household or a community would respond to a particular hazard. And other times it's being used in a much broader way to think about a variety of hazards. But there are, I would say, very core concepts that tend to translate across space. So it's not just economic. It's not solely income or poverty level. It's other characteristics that might include age, household structure. If you kind of, those are things that maybe are on the individual or household level, then there, I would suggest, are also community level characteristics that make a community more vulnerable. Things like being dependent on one business sector, one major employer, and not having a diversity of options. So if a big company closes or leaves the community, everybody's unemployed. Those types of factors are things that I think we would kind of think of as part of social vulnerability. And it really, it's an important concept to fold over into hazards because, and I would say, to kind of your talk as well, the idea of these short, more acute hazards or the long-term kind of chronic stressors and hazards, because it really has a tremendous influence on the way those hazards impact the population, how long that impact lasts, the magnitude of it. So I think for that reason, it's a really critical concept in terms of disasters. And I'm glad that I'll have others who can address it more fully, because it really deserves its own presentation. There was somebody in the back over here I'm going to go to first. She had her hand up before.
I'm Deborah Williams with Building Resilient Communities, and we work with primarily with the faith-based community here in Riverside and San Bernardino County. You had talked a little bit about the incentive of insurance going down, premiums going down, and that's one of the ideas that we have really been working on, that if the faith-based community can get up to certain standards, which we have not found any national standards, and so we're sort of developing them ourselves, working with FEMA. But I really would like to know more about the agencies that you're talking about that are working on that, because we've called nationally to try to find someone who would even be interested in talking with us about how could we develop the standards, how could we make it national, as an incentive for the faith-based community.
Well, I personally would love to talk to you about that, because I think it's, I think that was one of the, when I saw that NIST was developing this program, and it's still a fairly new program, and they were expanding out to include social science, and they really had this emphasis on the idea of measurement of and creating, some kind of overarching way to think about resilience and what is it that we're aiming for. I was so pleased because I think the concept has been around for a while, but doesn't have a lot of quantitative kind of how do we measure it to back it up. And in order to put it into place for things like lowering insurance premiums, we have to have some way of across the board, an agreed upon way of measuring how much are we kind of reaching and achieving on this trajectory. So I definitely, and I'm happy to kind of try to make other contacts too, because I think we're starting to find the spaces within federal agencies where they're interested in this work in a broader way, and everybody focuses on their narrow slice of it. So FEMA's going to look at their little piece of it, and we're going to look at our little piece. But I think our group is trying very hard to figure out how to broaden that perspective and what are the other partners that come into the mix. So the Resilience Panel is co-sponsored by several different federal agencies that all have some stake in resilience, and they're trying to come together on that. And I think, the membership in that panel is also part of trying to bridge these gaps and connections.
I know Millie and Bruce.
And then maybe one more.
One question I have in this area of research is something that comes out of work that I've done related to this, but that is, much has been said about the role of non-government organizations oftentimes in these scenarios, but there's also been critique about sometimes the over-reliance on non-government organizations. And I was curious to know, in your own observation and in the work that you do, what are some of the characteristics about the balance and the relationship between what you would call an effective model of the engagement between NGOs and government organizations?
I think it's a really good question, and I participated several weeks ago in a disaster scenario exercise. It was a tabletop exercise, and different tables of people were assigned different roles and different entities. And what was fascinating, the person who was running this exercise, we started with kind of a day 1 scenario, and then a day 3 and a day 7. And in the beginning, everybody from every table did what he says always happens in a real disaster, which is they all flooded the non-governmental relief organizations first, and those organizations had nothing to offer yet. They were just hitting the ground. They were just trying to show up and understand the situation. And I thought that dynamic was fascinating because I was sitting at the government table. There was another table of private sector people. It took longer for the people in the room to start going to these other entities. And it made me question kind of what is this responsible reliance, and how, and are we expecting too much out of the NGOs in a community. And I don't know that I've seen yet in the places that we've been working a great model. And in my own work, what I've seen as perhaps the most effective model is when you've got great partnership across levels, and no one group is solely on the hook for things. But it's so rare. I've only encountered it kind of periodically where the federal, the state, and the county government were all working really well together. There were organizations that were non-governmental that were playing into the mix and fulfilling pieces of the puzzle. But even in those cases, it needed to be someone had to lead it. Someone had to kind of maintain the relationships and the momentum. And so I don't know that I have an ideal example of how that works. But I think it's certainly something that I think would be an interesting avenue for research, actually. So thinking about looking at case studies of communities that have tried different combinations of planning approaches and engagement approaches. What are some of the things that lead to success? What are some of the issues and conflicts that arise? I think those are really important questions because they actually have a very practical impact on how we move forward. And we can give guidance on these things. Like, these are questions that we could examine enough events, enough communities to start to understand which arrangements are favorable. So I think that might be, a really important kind of way forward on that. I'll go to Bruce, and then I know there's one back here, and then I'll come to you. Okay.
I'm Reshmi. I'm a student in Global Impact doing a master's in health policy. So talking about insurance incentives and premiums, how would you include that group of people who are under no insurance plan? How would you, you have people who are not a part of the community active, like I'm talking about people who are homeless.
Mm-hmm.
How would you include them into your education plan? Because I think at the part of, when it comes to a necessity to the society, we know the place where we stand, we are educated, we know our eyes and ears are open, we know what's going to happen, and we're aware of it. How would you include these kind of people who have no idea about what's going to happen, or maybe who just don't have any interest, and how would you engage them into your program?
I think it's a really interesting question because that needs to be one of the perspectives or one of the groups that's represented in that collaborative planning process, but it's not likely to be represented by the individuals themselves. So homeless or other populations that don't own a home, so aren't required to have insurance, are disproportionately going to be impacted if a disaster strikes and they suddenly have maybe a decrease of the services they were relying on. It's maybe unsafe for them to stay where they have been staying. So those sorts of factors, but even in thinking about how we get information out before a disaster happens, these are not groups that are all tied into the networks that we receive information from. We're finding already there's lots of research happening on disaster communication, risk communication. This is not happening in the ways it used to. In the past, many people don't have television sets in their homes anymore. The standard mechanisms for disseminating information have changed, and there's this new reliance on social media and putting out alerts through phones. There's a group of people that don't have that technology either. So thinking about how that folds in, I think, is important as part of that community kind of process of how do we make sure we're representing all the needs and the interests. And I would say it might not come out initially at the development of that planning team, but when you start characterizing the social dimensions of the community, and you realize you've got particular subpopulations that are highly vulnerable for various reasons, then it becomes important. The planning team realizes, oh, we have to include this group or think about this group in particular in the planning effort. And so I would say all the more reason for those who are knowledgeable to be part of that characterization process, to make sure that those important kind of groups are not being missed or overlooked by those individuals who might be looking across the census data and trying to figure out who should we be worried about in the community.
We have probably time for 2 questions. So Bruce, and then, okay, great.
Okay, thanks. Like Anil, I really want to thank you for presenting this 6-step approach and stuff. It seems really useful and comprehensive. Every time I thought, well, she should be talking about this, the next slide was about that. But anyway, it sounds like it could be really useful and helpful. And so let's imagine that it is. And then one worry I have is that as we disseminate it, the kinds of people who are most likely to pick it up would be people who are already sort of on that track.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we'd imagined it spreading throughout the cities or whatever, and then having all of them have a disaster, it might help overall, but there would be creating
Right.
inequalities
Right.
between. I mean, you might be able to mitigate that by having some kind of effort to make sure that those communities who are least likely to pick it up, you do something extra so that they have a chance.
Right.
Has anybody thought about that?
So one of this is because this program is new, I would say it's also forging a lot of unusual ground within this particular agency. A piece of the program is actually devoted to outreach with the guide, with the materials, and has so far consisted of one individual from our team kind of going around and speaking with communities and meeting with people and talking about the usage. And I think he's actually being quite conscious of that and trying to actually initiate the effort in particular places, as well as responding, because you might find there's one person who says, I don't think my community's ever going to go for it, but and we don't have resources, but this would be really useful. And he's really trying to kind of go that extra mile. But I have this kind of personal concern that that's a tough effort to sustain long term, and that we need to find the right mechanisms of doing that for the long term. But I think that like finding those the communities that aren't already doing resilience work, aren't proactive in their approach, is important in the long run to be able to assess the effectiveness, because it's hard to assess it if we only look at the communities that are likely to have success. But part of, I think, the reality of being in a new program and building support and long-term investment is that you naturally go towards the surefire kind of, these communities are going to take this and run with it. But trying to find that balance and trying to find the ways to draw in the others, because I think you're right. What we could see is this, over time, the overall costs are going down, but it's only because particular places are engaging. So we're really talking about this, and some of the stakeholders that are involved in the panel are talking about how to convince communities that aren't thinking about this kind of thing, how to convince them that this is important. And I think people are grappling with this. I don't think they've come up with the answers about how, but they're really trying to think about how can we persuade and communicate the importance of these approaches in places that aren't, their minds just aren't here yet in terms of thinking about it.
So we have one last question from Diana.
Actually, I teach in the Department of Computer Literature and World Languages at UCL. I actually have three issues I've been thinking of since the initial talk, so sorry. The first one has been built on understanding about dissemination of information, which is very important, and raising awareness. I feel that we really need to do more about this kind of dissemination and awareness raising through the K-12 or K-16 education. And in fact, about what Bruce was talking about, and also the other speakers, the other I think the students can really do a whole lot in the community, especially to communities that have different, non-English speaking communities. I think they can do a whole lot of dissemination here, not only to their families, but also their neighborhoods, communities. I feel that they can do a whole lot. But definitely our education as a critical is a very important part. Now, second, about streamlining the resources. I think there is a whole lot of problems in terms of streamlining national, state, federal, and then NGO. A lot of the resources, how to we streamline them so that they can be sort of win-win situation for all. Another one is can we incorporate the knowledge and also the resources that's being obtained abroad, such as, for example, in terms of earthquake. I'm thinking of Japan and Taiwan. Their experiences in recovery and resilience efforts, as well as also the fact that they can actually send out experts to help us in the most critical 3 days, for example. I feel that there seems to be more of this kind of international collaboration, not only in terms of knowledge transfer, but also in terms of enlisting support in those critical moments.
Yeah, I think on that last point, the international collaboration potential, I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago hearing about some of the resilience efforts that are happening abroad, and there's amazing progress, there's amazing financial support for these, and entire university programs that are now being developed around the effort. So I think you're absolutely right that there's incredible learning to happen from that transfer. And also, I mean, we've seen that kind of go both ways, interestingly. We've seen some international partners pick up the guide and take it abroad, and then kind of they're providing great information and response back. I was hearing a really wonderful example of work that's being done in New Zealand following the Christchurch earthquake, and they said, well, the thing is we have a captive population. We're an island, we're kind of separated, it's distinct, but also there's all this local government incentive for engagement on the issue of resilience planning. But still, what's working there and how they're approaching it, I think provide great lessons. On the education front, I think that's such a wonderful idea and comment about the education system. Where I've seen it starting to take hold is curriculum development for university, so kind of undergraduate and graduate training, where I think we have some room to go, and where it would be really fascinating to go next is to see it become part of younger students' curriculum and some of the concepts and approaches being part of how they're trained. I think we have seen that. We've been pushing for that for a long time on environmental science side. We know that's an important way to kind of generate this group of citizens that understands the importance of balancing various needs with the health of the environment. It's a really important thing to think about doing that in this realm of work too. So thank you for those comments.
So and on that note, I think we end the morning session. We will be breaking for an hour from 11:30 to 12:30. But before I go on to telling you a little bit about the next phase of the program and the logistics, let's give a hand to Maria for a really